This is the Whimsy Farm Podcast. I'm Carolyn Crane.
There's a big wide world right out your door. Good people doing good things. Whoa, it's a big wide world. Now is the time. Now is our time.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 23 of the podcast. Today, I speak with Nell Bernstein, the directing advocate for communications at the Youth Law Center in Sacramento, California. Nell is the author of All Alone in the World and Burning Down the House, as well as a recipient of the White House Champion for Change Award. Nell Bernstein's latest book, In Our Future We Are Free, chronicles the dismantling of the youth prisons in the United States and is the focus of our talk today. Welcome to the Whimsy Farm Podcast, Nell Bernstein.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
It's great to have you. And you've done such important work with this book. I'm excited to talk about it. And I wanted to start by exploring two 20th century missteps, grave errors that had great impact. I'm referring to the nothing works trope and the fiction of the super predator. Can you talk about how these terms precipitated the suffering of so many children?
Sure. Why don't we start with the super predator? Because I think that, yeah, you hit the nail on the head. But these two tropes moved us in kind of similar but distinct directions. So in the 1990s, youth crime had peaked and begun what would be a 30-year decline. But despite that, a group of academics, particularly a guy at Princeton named John DiIulio, essentially spliced speculative demographics with very old racist tropes to come up with this mythical creature that they called the super predator. And their idea was that coming demographic changes, which would mean more young people and particularly more young Black people, were spawning a generation that they described in the most inflammatory imaginary terms. No conscience, no parents, no sense of right or wrong, would just be roaming the streets and would take us all out if we didn't do something. And, it would have been one thing if it had stayed in academia, but the mainstream media just ate it up. So all the major news weeklies, remember when there were major news weeklies, had pictures of glowering young Black men in hoodies on the cover with inflammatory headlines about super predators. And in terms of the damage that that trope wreaked, I saw it both personally and politically. During those years, I was editing a youth newspaper in San Francisco, working with a group of young people from around the San Francisco Bay Area who were diverse in every possible way. And I saw, it wasn't that unusual for one of my young staff to get arrested on the way to our downtown office, or at least hassled by police. When I would walk down the street with a young Black man who was one of my writers or editors, it wasn't unusual for passersby to ask me if I was okay. It got to the point where one of my staff had a t-shirt made that he would wear downtown that said, "No, white lady, I don't want your purse." And people didn't laugh. I could see them relax when they saw that statement. So it really just kind of battered these young people. And at the same time, politicians grabbed hold of it and used it to pass a series of extreme laws, largely laws that expanded the transfer of children to adult court. So it had ripple effects for decades. And even though my book chronicles a very positive transformation, those racist tropes are with us to this day.
And where does the nothing works fit into that?
Yeah, so that was a little different. That was a study that purported to have it wasn't youth specific, but it purported to have reviewed every rehabilitative program or intervention out there, a meta-analysis, and found that not one of them worked. Um, in both instances, the researchers had to recant their findings because subsequent research and subsequent reality found that they just weren't true. But that idea that rehabilitation didn't work also worked its way into the culture and also exacerbated this practice of trying children as adults. Because if there's no rehabilitating somebody, then I guess the only way to keep us safe is to lock them up indefinitely. Um, and we can talk about this later, but I talk about the Nothing Works study in a chapter that I call Everything Works, because of course there are a million ways to make things better for children and create a safer world. We know that all intuitively if we've ever parented or been or met a teenager. We just somehow decided that there was a group of kids to whom this universal truth didn't apply.
You tell so many stories in your book. You take your audience all across the country. And I want to go to a few of those places with the audience today. So you tell your reader about some things that happened in New Orleans at the Tallulah Youth Prison. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, Louisiana is such a complicated story. But, the book looks at this 75% drop in youth incarceration that we've seen. It looks at the closure now of more than two-thirds of the nation's youth jails and prisons. Young people were a powerful force, but in Louisiana in particular, parents were a very powerful force. Uh, the Tallulah Correctional Center for Youth was a particularly brutal institution, not uniquely, because I have yet to find an institution where children are not abused, neglected, and sometimes tortured in solitary confinement. But at Tallulah, one mom described going to see her then 12-year-old child who had, I think, been involved in taking a radio out of a car and finding him with a bruise on his chest in the shape of a guard's boot. At one point, things got so out of control at Tallulah that they brought in a warden from the Angola State Penitentiary, and even he was shocked. He told a reporter, essentially every kid has a broken nose or a perforated eardrum. It was just a brutal place. And a little youth rights startup called the Louisiana Juvenile Justice Project was developing a lawsuit against Tallulah. And their receptionist, a woman named Gina Womack, who is doing this work to this day, 30 some years later, started getting calls from parents. And class action litigation doesn't allow for helping individual children, but Gina decided she was going to do that. So she gathered parents for what initially were just support group meetings, but over time, the parents started an organization called Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children, developed very sophisticated organizing skills, legislative advocacy, but also sort of dramatic street theater. At one point, they held a jazz funeral, a mock jazz funeral, which is an old New Orleans tradition, but they were mourning the loss of their children's dreams. Got a lot of coverage,
Mm.
got legislators involved, and eventually they were able both to close Tallulah and get a piece of legislation passed that promised to revamp the whole Louisiana system. That didn't happen, and we can talk more about that if you'd like. Uh, but amazingly, in Louisiana, I've now met young advocates who are the grandchildren of the original mothers of FLIC, which is the acronym. So their fathers were incarcerated as young people, their grandmothers fought to close Tallulah, and now they are fighting for the young people of Louisiana. So it's an amazing multi-generational movement there.
You said it hasn't happened yet. Can you follow up on that? What is going
Yeah,
on?
I mean, that might be the biggest understatement I've made today. Uh, n- Not only did Louisiana not implement this law, it has gone backwards in a really horrific way. The number of youth incarcerated is down as it is nationally, but the way these kids are treated, um, so during the pandemic in Louisiana and elsewhere, things got very dire inside locked institutions. Guards weren't coming to work. Young people were hearing all kinds of rumors, were terrified for their families, and worst of all, anytime there was a case anywhere in the institution, they would get put on these quote unquote quarantines that were essentially lockdown. So there was some violence on the part of young people in some of the institutions, which under those conditions shouldn't have surprised anyone. Louisiana responded not by trying to remedy some of the things that were creating this pressure cooker. They initially sent kids to a sort of a secret, all solitary supermax in an old abandoned adult prison where even their parents didn't know where they were. That they had to give up on that after ProPublica found out and exposed it. And then, in one of the most horrifying moves I've seen in recent years, or really ever, they decided to send children to an abandoned death row at Angola, the Angola State Penitentiary, which is notorious. It's a former slave plantation where, as these kids rode in on the bus, they rode through fields where men in chains were working the fields under the watch of armed guards on horseback. So the slavery connection wasn't just historical, it was visceral. And then they were placed in this unit where you could still see signs that identified it as a death row, but they had put like little slogans, happy little slogans over some of the signs. Eventually, they were released because of litigation, including one of the attorneys, a guy named David Utter, who had founded the Juvenile Justice Project of Litigation of Louisiana. But even then, they were transferred not to a real youth facility, such as that might be, but to a wing of the Jackson Parish Jail. And when David Utter, this attorney, went to visit them there, he found the same practices. There would be a fight or an infraction, and a whole unit would be led outside and forced to kneel all night uh, in the cold. He said, I might as well have been at Tallulah 30 years ago. So, what that story tells me is that uh, something that I also learned in reporting my last book, Burning Down the House, um, which is that the real recidivists are the institutions. That these places just can't be fixed.
That's well said. Yes. Okay, let's go to Washington, D.C., where we meet Vinny Schiraldi. Uh, I think the quote that you used is so powerful. He says, what I inherited was a nightmare. Eli Wiesel was right when he wrote that the opposite of love is not hate, it's apathy. Can you tell us more about what Vinny Schiraldi was up against in Washington, D.C.?
Sure. So Vinny was part of a small and fascinating group of change agents who took on the job of running state youth prison systems with the express intent of running them into the ground. So I talk about Vinny, I talk about an amazing woman in New York, Gladys Carrion, and then Candace Jones in Illinois. But Vinny was the first. Vinny was an advocate, is an advocate in his bones, but somehow went from essentially lobbing bombs at the system to wrangling his way into a job running it. Uh, I won't go into all the reasons why that happened. So while people like parents, youth activists, movement lawyers were trying to dismantle these places from the outside, Vinny was working with them from the inside. And he and David Muhammad, who was his deputy, managed to do two remarkable things. They closed Oak Hill, which was a horrific facility outside of DC. Um, you know, just all the nightmares. Rats, vermin, no functioning boiler, not enough to eat. And the kind of abuse You would think I wouldn't be shocked anymore, but one guard was quoted in the Washington Post with no compunction about using his full name as kind of bragging about having knocked a kid out at a football game that was held for those youth. He said something like it was the first time I had ever knocked a kid out with a helmet on. Such impunity that he didn't mind using his name, just on and on and on. So they did two things simultaneously. They worked to close Oak Hill, and at the same time, and not every state did what Vinny and David and others did, they built an alternative, a place called New Beginnings that is still there. It's still locked, but it is much more like a campus than a traditional youth prison. So they brought in a charter school. Kids could do things like open their windows, which is unheard of in a youth prison. They trained the staff in a very different mentality. So they simultaneously dismantled one institution and built the alternative.
Okay, now we're going to go to California
All
and
right.
talk about the books not bars movement. Can you tell us
Yeah.
about that?
So that's my home state. I got to see a lot of what happened in California firsthand. Books Not Bars is an interesting slogan because it was adopted first by young people. Way back in the super predator days, we had an initiative on the ballot because we like to have ballot initiatives here in California called Proposition 21, which purported to be an anti-gang measure, but was largely a means, again, of facilitating the transfer of more young people to adult court. It also did some weird things like it defined a gang as three or more young people dressed in similar attire. So that would include every sorority and fraternity in the country, uh, but they weren't targeting Greek life. Um, but what was amazing in California was that young people, both those who had been impacted and those who had seen their classmates impacted, just poured into the streets with this very creative campaign under the slogan Books Not Bars. They now we talk about the school to prison pipeline. They were the first to say, if you're investing this much money in incarcerating my cousin, that means I don't have books. Really powerful argument. So there was this youth movement, and then simultaneously, as in Louisiana, there was parent organizing, and the parents also organized under the slogan Books Not Bars. And it's fascinating when you look at some of the archival images because you'll see Books Not Bars signs in both Louisiana and in California. And this was, before everybody was connected via social media. So it took actual human interaction to make these connections. And, the parents, the kids were not successful in stopping Prop 21, but they continued to fight. They were successful in stopping Alameda County, where I live, from building what would have been the largest per capita youth jail, so county detention facility in the country. And they used protest. They went to the Board of Supervisors. They did all the traditional stuff. But I think their most fascinating strategic move, with the support of some adult allies, was they reached out to largely white homeowners in Dublin, which is a suburb where they were proposing to build this institution, and said, you don't want this in your backyard. We don't want to be in your backyard. Then they reached out to health advocacy groups to make the case that the money that would go to building this enormous detention facility was money that could go to healthcare, got them on board. So it's incredible coalition building. And they did manage to block that. And over years and decades of activism, the parents and many others were successful in closing a number of California Youth Authority, which is what we used to call our system, a number of those institutions, and drained enough kids out of them that in 2020, Governor Gavin Newsom closed our state youth prison system entirely.
And I'll get to that later. I have a
Yes.
special
Okay.
question saved for that.
All right. Then I won't
So,
get into it now.
and you're right, not only about the different pockets of movements, but also some remarkable individuals. so many, and they've really been anchors in this movement to close the youth prisons. And one man that really stands out is Aaron Talifoa. I think I'm saying his name right. Aaron
Totally forward.
Talifoa.
Almost.
Can you tell us his story?
Yeah. So Aaron, I spend a lot of time with Aaron and his story in a chapter on adult transfer. And that's important because one of the kind of concerns that advocates had as they began to see victories in closing youth prisons was that if judges didn't have that harsh alternative, they would send more kids into the adult system. Not only did that not happen, adult transfer is down more than 80% from its high around 2000. Aaron is a kid, well, he's an adult now, but he was a kid who got caught in the middle of that transformation. Uh, when he was 15, he committed a series of carjackings, and he was given a decades-long adult sentence. In the middle of his sentence, the Washington State Supreme Court made a decision which stemmed from several important US Supreme Court decisions that rolled back the use of adult incarceration in Washington State. And that meant that Aaron, who was in a youth institution at that point, was able to appeal his sentence and get it shortened somewhat. While he was incarcerated, Aaron connected with a number of advocacy groups. He helped write a piece of legislation that allowed young people serving adult sentences to stay in the youth system until they were 25. There's a picture of him signing that bill alongside the Washington State governor. Just a really remarkable advocate and also, I think, mentor to other young men. Um, and in a twist I didn't see coming because I followed Aaron's story for several years. He ultimately, because he had connected with so many people and groups on the outside and formed these strong alliances with them, he was able to petition for clemency. And with the support of a number of community organizations, he got it. And the thing that to me is the most powerful about Aaron's clemency, and I watched the clemency hearing, is that the deciding voice wasn't his attorneys, wasn't the people advocating for him, wasn't even his own. The man that he had harmed most grievously, the third time he tried to take a car from a driver, that driver went for his own gun, and Aaron shot him with a rifle in the shoulder and permanently disabled him, ending his career as a nurse. So real harm. And this guy had been at all of Aaron's previous appeal hearings to say, don't let him out. The impact is too great. This time, and he couldn't even quite explain it, something had changed. This time he asked the Board of Pardons and Clemencies to let Aaron go. And because he had medical training, he said the years between, I guess, 15 and 25, which were the years that had passed behind bars from Aaron, are as important developmentally as the years between 0 and 3. And I've seen this young man change, and I can't go on with my life until he goes on with his. So please let him go so we can both go on with. Yeah, it's very moving. I mean, just the kind of insight and courage from somebody who had been seriously harmed by a teenager. It is very moving. And amazingly, he was citing the same brain science that the Supreme Court cited in dialing back things like the death penalty for juveniles and mandatory life without parole. So yeah, that was a powerful journey for Aaron and for this man.
And it was remarkable to me that when Aaron was incarcerated at 15, he was already a father.
Right. And that was another thing that the man whom he harmed said is let him out to be a father to his son.
Oh, yeah, that story really impacted me when I read the book and again just now.
Yeah, I can see
So,
that.
in your introduction, you write, my hope is that a portrait of the stunningly successful movement to close down youth prisons might serve as a case study in how major social change can be achieved. And in the book, you speak of protests featuring art, music, and joyful presentation. In fact, the title of the book, In Our Future We Are Free, is taken from street art of the movement. Can you talk about what you've witnessed as a case study for the larger vision of social change and social justice?
Yeah, I mean that's a funny question for me because I started working on the book in 2020. And at the time, height of the pandemic, but I got news of this remarkable transformation, 75% drop in youth no, I guess then it was a 66% drop. So when I wrote the book, I really thought of it as something for the field, that it would be useful to those involved in the effort to dial back youth incarceration, and maybe also to those involved in the movement to dial back incarceration writ large. But then the book was published in November of 2025 into a very different world. Um, and I think I realized that before the book came out, the morning after the presidential election, the day after, rather, I went to speak to a law school class at UC Berkeley. And I got there and I saw these young people who just looked so despondent and confused about what was about to hit them that I basically threw away my notes and decided to have a different conversation. And I said to them, I asked them some questions about how they were feeling. And I thought, and I said to them, so here we all are feeling in this, for many of us, powerful but abstract way that we're about to be crushed under the boot of an authoritarian state. And we're struggling with the question of how do we resist that, right? I'm going to tell you stories about people for whom that was not at all abstract. They were living under the total power of an authoritarian institution. We talked about the parents. Either they were living under the boot of this institution or their children were in the control of this institution. And still, they found ways to resist. So I think the lessons and even the sort of joyful artistic activism that you're talking about, I don't know, I thought of the Portland Frog for a minute. I mean, that's only one form of resistance, but the street theater that the parents engaged in has been a part of the resistance here. So I feel like the lessons in the book have unfortunately become relevant to many more of us than they were when I started writing the book.
And it struck me too that it came from that absolutely grassroots level. It came from incarcerated children finding a stub of a pencil and finding a scrap of paper to write and writing something about what was happening to them and successfully smuggling that out at great personal risk so that someone could help them.
I'm glad that you said that because that's really the story I wanted to tell. Because one thing I realized, I was reading about other social movements as I was writing this book, is that movements are coherent only in retrospect. We look back and we say, Rosa Parks was tired. We look at Martin Luther King or Gandhi or Cesar Chavez, and we tell their stories. But that's not how movements happen. When you look at them in their kind of seed phase, I can't think of a movement in the history of this country, really in the history of the world, that hasn't been sparked and largely led by those most affected. And I think in our kind of veneration of single great men leaders, we forget that. But that is the story I found. And I think that's the story of every social movement.
And Rosa Parks wasn't tired. Rosa Parks was carefully chosen because of
That my
who she
point
was and
exactly.
totally trained at Highlander for that moment. There was no happenstance about it, and that's why it worked so well. So I appreciate your comment. And that brings us to Gavin Newsom because you talk about what happened with those youth prisons closing, and that was not a grassroots from the bottom up. That was a top down more with what he did, is
Yeah.
from what I understood from reading your book. Can you talk a little bit about how not to close a youth prison and what you learned from that?
Yeah, which is what I title the California chapter. I will say California is a both and. So Newsom in 2020, the pandemic hit. He thought that there was going to be a budget deficit, and he decided to balance this deficit, which never actually happened, by essentially zeroing out California's state youth prison system in the budget. I will say he could never have done that had there not been decades of activism that had shrunk the population in that system from about 10,000 kids to I think 800 by the time he did it. So, yeah, grassroots organizing allowed it to happen, but the fact that he did it unilaterally and without preparation kind of created a train wreck here in California. I will say things are changing somewhat in the years since I did my reporting, but it's almost, it's just insane what we did. So Newsom zeroed it out in the budget, and then the legislature had to quickly write a law to implement it. And the law that they wrote, because Newsom talked a lot about reimagining juvenile justice and ending it as we knew, ending the youth prison as we knew it, and blah, blah, blah. The law they wrote required that every county create therapeutic, trauma-informed, culturally informed, blah, 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 blah alternatives. But the state code wasn't rewritten, and that state code required that kids be kept in locked facilities. So, because of that mess, what happened was that every county in California took a wing of their existing juvenile hall, called it a secure youth treatment facility, which is the name of the thing the law required them to have. One advocate described it as painting the walls periwinkle. They did, paint some of the walls. They brought sofas in. I read every county plan. One county had a sensory de-escalation room. One had a treasure chest that you could reach into if you had behaved particularly well and get an egg that might have a slip of paper in it entitling you to an extra visit or something. So a lot of sort of cosmetic changes. But the thing is, juvenile halls are arguably worse than state youth prisons, and that's saying a lot. It's essentially like the jail prison distinction. The juvenile halls are run by the counties. They're meant for short-term pre-trial detention. They're not meant for somebody to be there for 5 or 6 years. They're meant for somebody to be there for a few weeks while their case makes its way through the courts. So inside those places, kids were even more locked down. Decades of litigation had introduced finally some decent programming at the state level. So these kids really went from the frying pan to the fire. There are now efforts to get some kids out of the fire, and I've become more optimistic, but we didn't do what Vinny did in DC. We didn't do what Gladys and Vinny did in New York. We didn't prepare anything for the young people, and that just created a really difficult situation.
So near the book's end, you quote a young woman who said, "When I think of burning, I think of regeneration. When I think of abolition, I think of abundance." Can you talk about this fundamental mind shift and what's happening now around this issue and around the broader issue of meeting these children's fundamental needs?
Yeah, so here's where we get to the really beautiful part, I think. You mentioned the title of the book, In Our Future We Are Free, which I pulled from a mural that young people painted in Richmond, Virginia. Um, I had originally thought the book would have two equal parts. One would chronicle the slow demise of the youth prison, and then the second half would look at what communities, neighborhoods, people were doing to pursue the ostensible goals of the youth prison system: safety, justice, accountability. Those are important. Harm is real. We need to prevent it and we need to address it. I don't have any illusions about that. Uh, but as I got into the reporting, the first half of the book sort of ate the second half. But I do have two chapters at the end where I look at what all kinds of community organizations and individuals are doing to seed safety and justice and accountability in their communities. I look at the Young Women's Freedom Center, which is an amazing organization out here run by women who were impacted by the justice system when they were young and are now working very hard to to make sure that the generations behind them don't have that experience. And then, you mentioned the Nothing Works study. I call the final chapter of the book Everything Works. Because in some ways, I think that chapter is an effort to rectify an error that I made in my previous book, Burning Down the House. In that book, when I tried to think about alternatives to the youth prison, I got very caught up in this idea of quote unquote evidence-based programs, which, are interventions that are evidence-based because there was enough money to study them in depth and, all kinds of multi-systemic therapy, names like that. And these are good interventions, but they are targeted at fixing a particular young person and their family. This time around, I asked different questions of different people, and I got a different answer. I asked young people who had grown up in these systems what they thought would seed safety and help them raise their children free and safe. Not one mentioned a program. They talked about things like parks and schools and clean air and water and sports and summer camp. And as a parent, that hit me so deeply because, of course, these are all the things that I wanted for my kids. I never thought, when things got rocky during adolescence, what program can I bring in? I thought, what opportunity can I offer my child? And I, I think the reason that we let things get so bad is that we somehow, it goes back to Vinny's quote about indifference or apathy. We somehow let ourselves believe that the young people we lock up were a different kind of kid, needed something different, wouldn't respond to the same kind of resources that quote unquote our kids needed. And that's just like that is the really cruel lie at the heart of youth incarceration. And it's a racialized lie, it's an othering, it's a dehumanization. And I think when you think about safety, I mean, Candace Jones, who closed a youth prison in Illinois from the inside, put it quite beautifully, I thought. She said, we're gaslighting communities of color when we ask them to envision safety and then tell them that they've come up with this creative solution. They're describing Evanston. She was in Chicago at that time. They're describing Hyde Park. They're describing well-resourced neighborhoods well-resourced neighborhoods that aren't, this is me talking now, I've stopped quoting Candace, that aren't over-policed. So I think if there's one takeaway, it's a big lift, but if we focused on ensuring that every child got what they needed, we'd be so much safer than focusing on removing a few.
So you recently accepted the position of directing advocate for communications at the Youth Law Center in Sacramento, California. Can you tell us about the work you'll do there?
I love the question. Today is my 2-week anniversary. So a lot of that remains to be seen, but I have admired and respected the Youth Law Center as long as I can remember. In fact, you made a reference to a chapter that focuses on their work. One of their attorneys, Sue Burrell, who took letters that young people had written from lockdown units and used them as a powerful lever for system change in California. So I'm this is an organization, it's a national organization, and it has been part of so many major changes in the youth justice sphere, but also the child welfare sphere. And I'm just going to be trying to help them tell their story because
It
people,
seems like a natural outgrowth of your 3 books.
very much so, very much so. But um, I wasn't sure what my title would be, uh, but I love having the word advocate in my title. I've always been this kind of strange hybrid of journalist and advocate. it's worked in my books, but you know, as a freelance journalist, people aren't necessarily interested in hearing me up on my soapbox. But I think in my heart, I'm an advocate, and writing is just sort of a tool that happens to be my tool. So I feel like this job is going to be one where I get to really use all of me. And I appreciate the question.
And that resonates with me. And I think there's advocacy journalism as a, some people look down on advocacy journalism as if there is a slant to it that's somehow unfair. And also, I know people sometimes say, what about the good old days of Walter Cronkite when everyone was neutral? And that's a myth, because the stories that were fed for Walter Cronkite to read were fed by a power structure that wanted to stay safely in place. And I think that advocates, from Amy Goodman to Nell Bernstein to the humble work I do at the Whimsy Farm podcast, are trying to even that scale a little bit, and talk about the people that are marginalized in our communities, that don't have the same voice that gets to the mainstream journalists that are supposedly not advocates. Do you see what I'm
No,
saying?
absolutely. And I've thought about it a lot. Is advocacy compatible with journalism? My mother was a journalist. I was raised sort of steeped in a more traditional journalism. You know, is it the why which paper used to say tell the truth without fear or favor? I don't think of advocacy as only telling a piece of the truth in order to get a particular aim. Call me naive, but I still think the truth is a very powerful force. I just don't think the truth has two sides. As a reporter, I think the truth has 100 sides, 1,000 sides. And it's my job to go out and hear all of it. And then, yeah, assimilate it, come to some conclusions about what's true. And in this instance, thorough reporting will only lead you to one conclusion, which is the same conclusion that everybody I interviewed, even those who worked within the system, reached, that tons of research has reached. Youth prisons don't keep us safer. In fact, they're criminogenic. There's studies showing that even a night or two in juvenile detention increases the odds of someone going on to commit crimes in the future. So I think part of my job as a journalist slash advocate is to break through this false dichotomy we've created between safety and the freedom of our young people. We can have both safe streets and free children. And if that's not evidenced by anything else, I forgot to mention that this drop in youth incarceration has coincided with a 75% drop in youth crime. So, however you want to parse cause and effect, closing these places down has not left us more endangered, despite the inflammatory headlines we still see all the time. It's left us much, much safer. And, what did Cronkite used to say? Good night and good luck. That's the truth as I see it.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you about your book and the work that you do. Is there anything that you would like to add or share that I haven't brought up?
I always ask that question and I can never answer it. But no, you read the book so closely. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was it's a good read. I strongly suggest it. In Our Future We Are Free. I'm so glad I read it, and I'm so glad I got to spend some time with you today, Nell Bernstein. Good luck on the new position, and I hope we keep in touch.
Thank you so much.
I've been speaking with Nell Bernstein about her new book, In Our Future We Are Free. Nell is the directing advocate for communications at the Youth Law Center in Sacramento, California. This podcast is produced on the sacred ancestral land of the Anishinaabe people. Thanks to the California band Castle House for writing and performing our music. The Whimsy Farm podcast airs the 1st and 15th of each month on our YouTube channel, Carolyn Crane and Whimsy Farm, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Thanks to our underwriters, Just Play Productions and Cannabis, and to our paid Patreon members for their support of today's podcast. If you'd like to offer your support, please visit my website, whimsyfarm.net, and click the Patreon link to find a level of support that's right for you. There is also a free membership level. You can email me through the website, as well as access all links to past and current episodes. That's whimsyfarm.net. Join me on April 15th when Mariam Barry and I celebrate National Poetry Month with a special edition of Poetry Sustains. We'll share with you nature poems that explore the idea of witness. Until then, remember the words of Utah Phillips, who said, "Too many good people are doing too many good things to afford me the luxury of being pessimistic." Get out there and create some positive change. Stay safe, everyone.
whimsyfarms.net